So we got to go back and say, well, these vitamin D clinical trials, where are we going wrong? Because it's really important that if we're going to go on studying vitamin D and show that our instincts are correct, that vitamin D is critical, that we have good levels of vitamin D, we have to study them properly and not waste time and money studying vitamin D in a way that gets dismissed as inappropriate later on. So the randomized controlled trial, I think, is the major problem. Let's look at randomized controlled trials. They're the gold standard in clinical research. And many of the recommendations by groups like the Endocrine Society in the US that have recently released recommendations have said they really will only consider randomized controlled trials. Any other way of looking at vitamin D, they're not really interested in. And that's because they're the gold standard of looking at drugs. So in a randomized controlled trial, you separate participants into, they're randomly assigned either to a treatment group or a no treatment group. And that helps eliminate bias and ensure that the groups are comparable. And that's the only way, if you do this, that you can be sure that one drug works compared to no drugs, etc. The other type of studies, observational studies, they study something in a real world setting. So you're looking at two variables, vitamin D and disease, but you're looking at participants in their natural state, and you're not intervening. You're just observing them, how much vitamin D they've got, what is their exposure to vitamin D, and whether they develop a disease or whether they have it or not. So a good classic example is smoking and lung cancer. So that was an observational study. The more smoking, the more lung cancer you saw. So what you find when you look at observational studies of vitamin D, almost exclusively they show that poor vitamin D status is a major risk for any chronic disease you want to look at, including immune diseases. So here are the problems with the clinical trials of vitamin D. There can be no true control group. A true control group should have zero amount of vitamin D in their blood. That is lethal. You have to have some vitamin D. So you're always looking at groups where you have an intervention and then you have a control group with varying levels of vitamin D already in their blood. This is blurring the boundaries between the two groups. So even if both groups start off with similar blood levels, there's no guarantee that the controls don't get extra vitamin D, either from sun exposure or supplements. You cannot lock people up for 5 years and say you're not allowed to go out in the sun. So basically, that's another variable that you can't control from. Of course, in drug trials, no participant has access to the drug under test. So many other factors come into play here. Your basic, as we saw in some of those studies in influenza, your vitamin D status matters. So if you're put into a clinical trial and you're deficient, they should know that, but they don't. They're not testing the blood necessarily. So they're saying, well, you may have deficient levels or you might have sufficient levels. That is not an adequate way to test vitamin D. And dose matters. Trivial doses of anything will show no benefit. An example I like to give is we know that one major factor in terms of health is economics. So the poorer you are, the more likely your health is to be poor. And so if you were studying health and finances, if you say, oh, these people, they're below the poverty line, we're going to give them an extra $1 a week to see, or an extra $1 even a day. Will that improve their health outcomes? No, it's too little to make a significant difference. So it's the same, dose matters. Trivial doses will show no benefit. Blood levels matter. It's amazing that many of the clinical trials don't even check the blood levels. They just give an amount of vitamin D and look at outcomes. And then the last thing that really is mostly ignored is weight matters. Overweight or obese people show no benefit, and there's a study there from a recent study from JAMA. And the reason for that is that the vitamin D isn't circulating. It's tucked into fat cells, and so it's not impacting organs and tissues. So there's another problem then, and that is very common, and it's called implicit bias. So implicit bias is where you have attitudes or beliefs without being consciously aware of them. And when you're reviewing something, basically you should review the literature impartially with an open mind and then draw your conclusions. What can happen is that people already have a mindset that says, I don't think this works. And then they can selectively cherry pick studies that confirm that. So if you have implicit bias, you might be inclined to give more weight to studies that align with your biases and dismiss contradictory evidence. So again, a fairly recent article looking at the randomized control trials that already exist says large vitamin D randomized control trials have been designed and conducted over the last few years. The vast majority of these did not restrict their study populations to individuals with vitamin D deficiency. And some even allowed moderate vitamin D supplementation in the placebo groups. Up to 800 international units a day have been used in some of these studies. In these randomized control trials, there was no significant impact on the outcomes they were measuring. And not surprising. So I first got interested in immunity and nutrition way back in 1979 when I read this paper by the late great, unfortunately, a researcher who was an endocrinologist and immunologist, David Horobin. And he wrote at that time that T cell function, remember how important T cells are in this, depended on key nutrients. And he highlighted vitamin C, the B vitamins, especially B6, zinc, and essential fats, the omega-3s and the omega-6s. He didn't highlight vitamin D because we really were asleep at the wheel with regard to vitamin C way back then. It wasn't until the 90s we started to get really, and early 2000s, that we started to get excited about vitamin D. What he said, though, is what influenced me. He says inadequate intakes of any of these will compromise T cell function. And also be aware that megadoses of single nutrients will only be minimally effective if intakes of other nutrients are inadequate. So think back to the studies we've just looked at. If we saw an impact of vitamin D, it was not as great an impact as we might have seen if all the other nutrients were also optimized. And that is something that is extremely hard to study.